partly due to the fact that Django lived in luxury apartments rather than a caravan throughout the war, and partly because French gypsies were never included in the Auschwitz decree before the liberation of France. It's unlikely that Django's gypsy origins would ever have led him to Auschwitz. This is not to say, however, that French gypsies didn't suffer during the war. In France, the authorities began to incarcerate nomadic French gypsies in early 1940. Though only a small fraction of these gypsies were to be sent to the death camps before the liberation of France, around 5,000 were incarcerated in total, an unrecorded number of whom died of malnutrition and disease. Hundreds more were undoubtedly shot in cold blood at roadsides. At least another 5,000 house-dwelling gypsies in France, of which Django was one, escaped persecution on a technicality of the law. By living in houses, these gypsies could avoid carrying the identity cards that would enable the French authorities to track them down.
The point about France, as opposed to most other countries, is that a distinction was made between nomadic gypsies and gypsies living in houses. And nothing happened at all to any gypsy living in a house throughout the war. It might have happened later if the war had continued. Now, Django Reinhardt was probably not classed as a nomad, because I doubt whether he was wandering around in a horse and cart at that time. He was probably living in a house. So from that point of view, he wouldn't have been affected by this law.
However, as a Belgian gypsy by birth, with Belgian papers, Django was more at risk than most.
Once the north of France became part of Belgium, it came under the same law as the Germans applied to Belgium. And in Belgium, all gypsies were taken to the camps, mainly Auschwitz, whether they were nomadic or not. Now, what happened next was they tried to look for Belgian gypsies in the camps in France. And gypsies in France with Belgian passports were in some cases sent to Belgium. But Django Reinhardt was not in a camp, so it didn't apply to him.
Thankfully for Django, the Nazi authorities in Belgium didn't extend their searches to include Belgian gypsies living in houses in France, though in all likelihood he would never have been sent to Auschwitz as long as he continued to be useful to the Germans. Well known across Europe for his work with the quintet in the 1930s, Django was readily exploitable as a star during the occupation. Although his music provided an undeniably important boost to the morale of French civilians, in reality he posed very little threat to the authority of the Nazi regime in Paris.
Vichy France is controlled, it's under control. It's only once there were problems with that control that they might think about arresting someone like Django Reinhardt. You know, what's he doing? He's playing jazz music, he hasn't even got lyrics. It might be decadent music, but it's not a focus enough for opposition to the Nazis, I don't think.
What influenced Django's survival, perhaps more than anything else, was the fact that Joseph Goebbels took a pragmatic approach to the regulation of jazz in the occupied territories, as he also did to a certain extent in Germany. Even before the war, Goebbels could see how popular jazz was, and that an outright ban would be difficult to enforce and cause potential unrest. Besides which, people were spending Reichsmarks in fistfuls in the dance halls and clubs of Germany's major cities, all helping to bolster the economy.
Es mag gut sein, Macht zu besitzen, die auf Gewehren ruht. Besser aber und beglückender ist es, das Herz eines Volkes zu gewinnen und es auch zu behalten.
You appropriate it, you don't ban it outright on the grounds that, and I'm speculating, but on the grounds that it would not be enforceable. You can create a whole series of statutory measures, but they're only ever good as how enforceable they may be.
Goebbels' official stance on jazz was largely dependent on the desires of the Wehrmacht, either at the front or on vacation, and to a lesser extent the demands of civilians. He was also under pressure to compete with the appeal of Allied Forces radio and V-disc records, and hence was forced to acknowledge that jazz could serve similar propaganda functions to the good of the Reich.
But then they found that, in fact, what was their best way of selling their propaganda? We'll play some jazz at the beginning of it.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
Another war, another prophet, another Jewish business trick, another season, another reason for making whoopee.
So when they send Lord Haw across the airwaves, they play some jazz first, because they know that's going to hook an audience. So Goebbels, the great master propagandist, you know, whatever he feels about jazz, has to, if he was to play Wagner, everyone would turn off.
It was this pragmatism that led to a disparity between what was officially forbidden in the fatherland and what was unofficially countenanced in Paris. Goebbels made a promise to the Wehrmacht, "Everybody wants in Paris," a phrase that teased troops with the tantalizing prospect of forbidden pleasures in reward for their continued loyalty.
Paris, during the war, was regarded as the place. I mean, it was the place where you would go on leave. It was regarded as particularly attractive. It had attractions more than anywhere else. You have to remember at the same time that under conditions of the occupation, you have to manage the local people. You simply do not use brutal means to suppress a population if you can get away with doing it in alternative ways.
Indeed, Hitler had little desire to impose a strict fascist regime in Paris, at least initially, in order to gain the cooperation of the French and exploit the country's economy to aid the war effort. By 1943, France had become the principal supplier of foodstuffs, raw materials, manufactured goods, and labour to the Reich. As far as the Nazis were concerned, the scourge of jazz in the occupied territories could be dealt with later.